Okay, so we are in Parsha, a Parsha that's called Tizaveh. Literally means that you shall command, referring to Moses, and continuing the general theme of building the Mishkan, building the temple for God in the desert. That at this point it's a portable, it's movable, it's transportable. You can build it and disassemble it relatively easily. And later it becomes, once they come into the land of Israel, it becomes a little bit more permanent. First, the Mishkan, the temple, travels to different locations. Eventually, they build a semi-permanent structure in the city, town of Shiloh. It's there for 369 years. Eventually, 480 years after the Jewish people enter the land of Israel, is when King Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem. And temple in Jerusalem is, of course, much more grand than the temple of the desert, but some of the basic features and some of the basic and the furniture that's commanded we read about last week, and some of it this week, is essential to all the temples. And as we mentioned last week, one important point of studying these portions of the Torah is not just to think about the technicality of what exactly happened in the service of the temple, which is very important, but also to figure out what is the relevance and the meaning in the spiritual temple, which is the heart of every person. As we mentioned before, we mentioned last week, that when the Torah introduces these portions of the Torah, that the commandment to build the Mishkan, to build the sanctuary, it says, "Ba'asuli mikdash," they should make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them. And the commentaries point out that the grammar of that verse is problematic, because it should have said, "And I will dwell in it," referring to the singular, referring to the temple. But instead, it says, "Make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell in them." And that led the sages to say that where God dwells, in addition to the physical sanctuary, which is considered a sacred space, but also God dwells within the heart of every person. And that creates an entire genre of study, as we mentioned, which is thinking about the dimensions and the meaning of the vessels of the temple, and to try to show what does it represent within our own life. We did a little bit of it last week, but of course we can do more. And the good news is that these portions are repeated again in 2 weeks and in 3 weeks, so we have more time to get into some of the details. But this week, most of the parsha is about, I would say at least half of the parsha is, again, intricate detail about the garments of the high priest. So there's the Levites, which are the family that is supposed to serve in the temple. Of the Levites, you have the priests. The priests are the descendants. Aaron, at this point, it's just Aaron, Moses' brother, and his 4 sons. At this point, he has 4 sons. The 4 sons are called the priests, the Kohanim. Aaron as the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, the great priest. And the Torah tells us about the garments of the high priest, again, in intricate detail. And that's half the parsha. And again, you have to think about what is the symbolism and what is the meaning of these garments in general, and also the specifics of the garments. So that is also something to engage in and take apart. That's the first half of the parsha. The second half of the parsha is the commandment of how to inaugurate the Mishkan, the temple, once it's built, the sanctuary, how to inaugurate it. Basically, there are 7 days that are called Shivat Yimei Miluim. The 7 days, literally, Miluim is lemale, is to fill up. So 7 days of sort of filling up this house. It doesn't say filling up with what, but it's training, Miluim, to fill in. In biblical, in modern Hebrew, if you're in the army and you get called to the reserve, so the reserve is called Miluim. That's what it's called. Maybe it comes from this parsha, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But it's sort of to fill in your quota or your duty, but in some sense it's to fill yourself up, to practice is to fill yourself up. And the Torah again gives specific details of how the priests were inaugurated, and this becomes that as well. So we have a lot of work cut out for ourselves. There's one anomaly that happens at the end of this parsha, which is strange, which is that one piece of furniture is introduced at the end of this parsha. even though all the other pieces of furniture, the ark, the menorah, I'm sorry, the ark, the table, the menorah, the outer altar, they offer the animals. That was all introduced last week. So last parsha was the building of the structure and the building of the furniture. And then you have this parsha, which sort of shifts focus to the priests, the garments of the priests. And then we talk about the garments of the preparation of the priests. And then at the end, almost like by mistake, God says, oops, we have one more vessel. Now we're going to talk about the inner altar. The inner altar was used to offer incense. So they had a precise recipe of incense, and they would every day offer the incense in the temple. It would create some smoke and a fragrance, and that's part of the service. But again, in some ways, it's different than all the other ones because it's placed at the end of this parsha instead of last parsha, which is also something we have to talk about. Okay, so that is the introduction to the introduction. Now we're going to hopefully share the parsha in a nutshell and see where we go. Here we go. The name of the parsha Tizaveh means command, and it is found in Exodus chapter 27, verse 20. So God tells Moses to receive from the children of Israel pure olive oil to feed the everlasting flame of the menorah, which Aaron is to kindle each day from evening till morning. The opening statement of this parsha is the commandment to light the menorah, which also is a question what exactly this commandment is doing here, because it's out of character with the rest of the parsha and last week's parsha, where we do not necessarily discuss the commandment to actually do the service. Rather, it's the commandment to build the vessels to enable the service, the performance of the service. So why exactly do we say here menorah is different? Command the Jewish people, let them bring oil, let's have an everlasting flame, and Aaron lights it every night, and it lasts from evening until morning. That's the opening statement. By the way, many shuls, not all shuls, Chabad shuls don't necessarily have it, but many shuls, Ashkenaz shuls, and other shuls, you'll have in the beginning of a temple called the Ner Tamid, an everlasting lamp. In other words, a lamp that burns continuously, and that's taken as a symbol for the menorah, because the menorah is referred to here as an everlasting flame, Ner Tamid, an eternal flame. So some synagogues capture that idea with that Ner Tamid in the beginning of the synagogue. Okay, in any case, second paragraph, the priestly garments to be worn by the Kohanim, the priests, while serving in the sanctuary as are described. All Kohanim wore, one, the ketonet, a full-length linen tunic, Michnasayim, linen breeches, mitznefet or migbat, a linen turban, avnet, a long sash wound above the waist. In addition, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore, number 5, the ephod, an apron-like garment made of blue, purple, and red-dyed wool, linen and gold thread, meaning it was made of blue, purple, and red-dyed wool, linen plus gold threads. The choshen was a breastplate containing 12 precious stones, inscribed with the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. The me'il is a cloak of blue wool with gold bells and decorative pomegranates on its hem. And the tzitz is a golden plate worn on the forehead, bearing the inscription, Holy to God. So here you have the garments of the high priest. Here it's only in 2 paragraphs. Of course, in the Torah, it's much longer. And then finally, for the second half of the parsha, they give you here in the nutshell, they give you 3 lines. Tizaveh also includes God's detailed instructions for the 7-day initiation of Aaron and his 4 sons, Nadav and Avihu, Elazar and Itamar, into the priesthood, and for making the golden altar on which the Ketoret, the incense, was burned. So again, some of the questions, as we mentioned, is almost like the beginning. Why are we talking about the specific commandment to write the olive oil? At the end, why is the golden altar, which was for the incense, why is it mentioned in this parsha, not that parsha? There's a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss. The only question is, as usual, where to begin. But other than that, we have a lot to talk about. Okay. So one way to think about a lot of what's going on in this parsha, or in general in these parshas, is that the temple is a home. But who is it a home for? Right? God says, it was called temple is a home. Make for me a home, and I will dwell amongst them. And certainly, once the temple moves to Jerusalem, God refers to it as a home, a permanent home, a house. But who is the home for? So one interpretation you would say is it's a home for God. That's the conventional. Another way to think about it, it's a home for God, but it's really a home for God and the people. It's really a home for the couple. In other words, God and the people together create this marriage, and the home for this marriage is the temple. And you could see that in rabbinic literature. So, for example, in the Song of Songs, which is a metaphor which is a story about a love story between a bride and a groom, and the commentaries explain that refers to the metaphor for the love of God and the Jewish people. So there it refers to the wedding. And the commentaries say that the wedding is the temple, is the giving of the Torah and the building of the temple, right? Because you have a wedding and you don't live in the wedding hall. You make a wedding, which is a place where bride and groom to come together and create the bond. But then you go home, and you go home is the place where the wedding is consummated. Reaches its peak. And in some sense, the giving of the Torah at Sinai is the bond and the covenant between God and the Jewish people. But you're not going to live in the wedding hall. You don't stay at Sinai. You go home. And then you build a home. And what's the home? And you build a home. The home is the temple. Now, if you think about the home being the temple, then you will realize that there are actually different features in the temple. Some represent God and some represent the Jewish people. Because a marriage is, on one hand, it's the becoming of one. We have to become one. On the other hand, a marriage also has to maintain the individual perspective and the individual style, the individual personality of both members of this marriage. Otherwise, an individual person could become erased, and that's not a good space to be in. So if you're looking at this temple, you have to think about, okay, so there's two perspectives merging. That's really how you have to think about it. And that's what a marriage is. And part of a marriage is a tricky thing, not just a marriage, but any relationship is tricky. Because on one hand, a relationship is the desire to become one. That's what we would call love, ahava, the desire to become one. On the other hand, a relationship must have something that is not commonly spoken about, but that is referred to as respect or awe. And what that would mean is that you have to recognize that although you want to become one with the other person, and therefore you want the other person to enjoy exactly what you enjoy and engage in exactly what you want to engage in, and if the other person doesn't feel exactly the way you do at this moment, you try to sort of convince them to feel that, because it's not coming from a bad place. It's coming from because we want to be one. On the other hand, what is necessary is the other side of the coin, which would be respect. And respect is recognizing that although there's a strong love, which is a desire to become one, there also has to be respect to the differences between people. And I may feel this way right now, you may feel otherwise, and that's okay. And you don't have to give up your perspective for me, and I don't have to give up my perspective for you. Hopefully, the two perspectives later could become harmonized, and then we are actually enriched by the differences between ourselves. And this is a difficult process for people to experience, especially if they're very much in love. So a person is very much in love, and then to recognize that the other person is different than me is a difficult process to go through, necessary for growth, necessary for a proper relationship. So coming full circle, in some ways, you want to talk about what is happening in this temple. In this temple, there's going to be two perspectives. There's going to be a divine perspective, and there's going to be the human perspective. And the human perspective and the divine perspective are actually separated. And they're separated by a curtain. And this curtain is almost inextricable. You can't really go from one to the other. The human perspective ultimately cannot assimilate and cannot become the divine perspective. But occasionally, in a moment of intimacy, you can go into the other person's deepest space. And what that would mean in the temple is that the temple primarily had two rooms, had 2 rooms and a courtyard, outside courtyard, but the inside had 2 rooms. It had the Holy and the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies was the seat of the Ark. All they had there was the Ark and the tablets, the 10 Commandments and the Torah that was in the Ark. Above the Ark was the covering of the Ark with the cherubim. That's another subject. We may get to it today. We may get to it in 2 weeks from now. But in any case, that's the Ark. And then there's the partition. The partition was made of material, but it's a partition. Nobody was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies. You read about that in the 3rd book of the Torah, in the book of Leviticus, and the great tragedy, the day they built the temple, the day of the inauguration of the temple, Aaron's 2 sons who had such a great desire to cleave to God, they ran into the Holy of Holies and they died. So that's another story. But so you don't go into the Holy of Holies except on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, once a year, the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies as a representative of all the people. So think about it, is even in a relationship, you cannot go into the other person's deepest intimate space unless there's preparation, unless there's consent, unless there's the proper preparation for that experience. So we have our chamber, God has his chamber, there's a partition we can't always cross. The opening parsha of this week's parsha is, could we bring some of the divine perspective into our perspective? That's why we start with the menorah. And that's why we talk about, we also say the idea of the menorah should be everlasting light. Ner tamid, eternal light. Because otherwise, why are we talking about the menorah? Like, how does that come? We mentioned the menorah last week. There's so many different services in the temple. Why mention the menorah here? So that's why we talk about the menorah has a very important significance to the whole theme of the temple, because the theme of the temple is, could you become close? Even though we're different than God, could we be enriched by the experience of being in the same home of God? So that's the roadmap of what I want to do in the next 3-4 minutes. I want to read the verses inside so you could see it for yourself, and then we could try to give some Kabbalistic interpretation. Most important thing, as usual, is to, if you have any comments, please share, because the perspectives will be enriched. That's what we're talking about here. Okay, here we go. So I opened the wrong thing. Okay, let's open up the actual Torah reading. Here we go, Parsha text. So the portion opens, God tells Moses, and you shall command the children of Israel, and they shall take to you pure olive oil, crushed for lighting, to kindle the lamps continually. Okay. Verse 20 to 21. In the tent of meeting, that's where it's happening in the temple. It's called a tent of meeting. By the way, meeting means 2 people coming together. Okay. The tent of meeting. Outside the dividing curtain that is in the front of the testimony. Okay, so I alluded to that, right? So you have the tent of meeting. Tent of meeting, there is a dividing curtain. The inner part of the dividing curtain, the inner room, where there's only the testimony, which is the tablets, the 10 Commandments that are inscribed on the stone, which are called the tablets of testimony. So outside that curtain, Aaron and his sons shall set it up before the Lord from evening until morning. It shall be an everlasting statute for their generations, from the children of Israel. And then all of a sudden we go to the next idea of choosing of selecting Aaron, designating Aaron and his sons to be the priests and sanctifying them. And this is how you shall sanctify them. And this is the garments they shall wear. But again, the whole idea of the candle seems out of place. So here is what we're trying to get at. If you look at the difference between the holy and the Holy of Holies, in other words, divine perspective and the human perspective, if you're going to look at the difference, when you adapt to the Kabbalah has all different words for saying this, talk about the Dat Elyon, the higher knowledge and lower knowledge, the different ways of saying this. But essentially, if you look at, there's 2 ways of looking at reality. When you look at reality from the divine perspective, everything is one with God. The only thing that exists is God. So in other words, when you look at the reality from the divine perspective, Even the physical world, even the negativity, everything in this world is an expression of a divine power to create. That's all it is. So you don't see the concealment. You don't see anything from our perspective, you see concealment. But from God's perspective, you don't see concealment. You see the divine power to create. That's divine. That's the divine perspective. There's no challenge. There's no space where you don't sense the presence of God. Even the world. What is the world? The world is an expression of a divine power to create. So within the art, you see the artist. That's Hashem's perspective. Our perspective is different. Our perspective, we are in the space of creation, of concealment, of spiritual darkness. And for us, we don't always sense the presence of God. So there are certain times and experiences where we do sense the presence of God. There's certain times and experiences we don't. And therefore, if you think about it, if you look at the Holy of Holies, the inner room of the temple, so in the inner room of the temple, what does that space look like? All there is there, only thing you have is the ark, is the Torah. That's all you have. And there's no real dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual, because the words of the Torah are engraved on the stone. And the Kabbalah talks a lot about this, the difference between writing something and engraving. Even in the Torah scroll, it's written. There's letters, there's ink written on the parchment. And if you write on the parchment, the ink and the parchment are still two entities. And that's why you have to check your tefillin and check your mezuzahs and check your Torah scroll, because those letters can actually crack off the parchment. It's not like letters on a piece of paper that could last for a few hundred years. Here you have letters that dry on the parchment, but the letters are a separate entity. When, on the other hand, by contrast, when you engrave on stone, here the letters and the stone become one. They're not two separate entities. So in the Holy of Holies, all you have is oneness. All you have is the Word of God. What is the stone? The stone is the conduit for the Word of God. It's the way God's Word is expressed. What is the physical? The physical is an expression of the divine power to create. You could be living in that reality. Most people don't. That's the divine reality. Our reality is that there's a very big difference between physical and spiritual. Sometimes we sense the spirit, we sense the soul, we sense that there's something greater than ourselves. We sense the transcending light. That is times that we would call spirituality. And then you have times that we're engaged in the physical, that yes, we're supposed to sanctify the physical, but the physical itself, we don't necessarily see any holiness. And that's why if you look at the holy, not the Holy of Holies, the outer chamber in the temple, here there's dichotomy. There's a difference. There's not one vessel. It's actually two. And then there's a third one to synchronize. We're not going to talk about the third one. You have the table and you have the incense, which is more spiritual. But let's leave it alone. You have the table and you have the menorah. What does table represent? We talked about this last week. Table represents the physical needs of a person. The menorah represents spiritual light. Certainly the incense in some ways is the most spiritual of all. It could be prayer. It could be feeling one with God, whatever the case is. But if you're in the Holy of Holies, if you're going into the deepest part of the temple, probably the deepest part of your soul as well, but that's another story. You're adapting the divine perspective. There's only oneness. All you see is spirituality and holiness. All you see is the presence of God. When you are outside the temple, when you are outside the Holy of Holies, when you're only in the holy, that's the space of our space, because again, we're also part of this marriage. Here, there's dichotomy. There's the physical, and then there's the spiritual. There's the table, and then there's the menorah. Now, what's interesting is they have to affect each other. So the Torah goes out of its way later to tell us in the placement of the vessels, the furniture, the menorah is aligned with the table, the same level. Because basically the physical and spiritual have to affect each other. The spiritual has to enlighten the physical. But the bottom line is, here we have two vessels. We don't have one vessel. We don't have the word of God engraved in the stone. We have two separate realities. We have the physical and the spiritual. And now we say, what's the job of the high priest? What's the job of a person? You're the priest, by the way. We'll talk about that later. You're the priest. Part of you is Aaron. You have to inspire yourself. And the point here is, could you bring the light of the menorah to shine from the evening till the morning? That's one expression, which represents there are differences. Sometimes you're more inspired. Sometimes you're less inspired. There's evening, there's morning, there's darkness, there's light. Could you bring the influence of the spiritual to every aspect of your life, tamid, continuously? So at this point, if you're from our perspective, that is something that takes work, and that's a challenge, and that's the service of the temple. Whereas from Hashem's perspective, that's just a given reality. So here's the example where we're both coming into a marriage, we're moving into a home. The home represents the partition. The partition is not a physical partition. The partition is a psychological partition. The difference between the divine perspective and the human perspective. But the human perspective, but because like in any other marriage, there's going to be moments of intimacy where we could become one with a divine perspective. When is that, by the way? That's Yom Kippur. We go into the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. There is no physical. We don't eat. We don't engage in any physical pleasures or physical intimacy. It's all spiritual. Okay. But that's the moment of intimacy. But then the rest of the year, we have our own identity. We have a dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual. The service is, could you be like a menorah? Could the menorah shed light on the table? Could the menorah bring light to your physical life? There's still a difference between physical and spiritual, but the physical enlightens and informs the spiritual enlightens and informs the physical. So that is why we start the parsha with what seems to be just a detail, light in the menorah. Okay, we know later we'll talk about all the services. Why is it bringing it here? Because here it tells you the purpose of the Mishkan is, could we who are outside the partition have some of the experience of being beyond the partition? If we're in a marriage, I'm different than you, but could I be enriched by your perspective? So that is by way of introduction. I didn't mean for this to take so long. So that's by way of introduction. Now we can go to the body of the parsha, which is the garments of the high priest. We could talk about the specific garments, which hopefully we'll have a few minutes to. We could talk about the general concept of garments, which is fascinating. The only problem is that I've said it in the past, so you may have heard it, but I think 3-4 minutes, it's important to talk about for 3-4 minutes, to talk about the idea of garments and why garments are a good thing, and why they're even being, why is this a requirement to have beautiful garments when you come to God? When you come to God to serve in the temple, you would think you should ask for things that are more spiritual. In other words, the requirement should be something more spiritual. But no, the Torah says the high priest must wear these beautiful garments. And if he doesn't wear these beautiful garments, he's liable for the capital punishment. In other words, this is a serious matter. You have to beautify your garments in the service of God. There's no other way to do it. So this leads to a beautiful, fascinating discussion about what our garments mean, what do they mean, how do they apply to us? And I'm going to try to do this very, very quickly because we talked about this in the past. So the first thing we want to talk about garments, is that in Hebrew, there's basically two words for garments, and they're opposites. One is called a beged, which in modern Hebrew is a much more common term, beged. And then there is a term that in modern Hebrew refers to a dress for a woman, simla, a dress, but in biblical Hebrew, that word is all garments. So we have two words, beged and simla. And beged is a very interesting word. Beged comes from the word, it actually is the same exact letters as betrayal. And that obviously has a negative connotation. Beged, betrayal. Garments are betrayal. Why are garments betrayal? So first of all, if you look at the biblical story, if you look at the book of Genesis, the concept of garments is negative because it comes as a result of the sin, right? If you look at the story of the tree of knowledge, before Adam and Eve sin and violate Hashem's commandment not to eat the tree of knowledge, they are naked and they're not ashamed. And all of a sudden, once they betray God's commandment, all of a sudden they sense their nakedness and they want a garment. So garment its origin is betrayal. Okay, that's point number one. But more importantly, a garment is betrayal because a garment it's external and it could betray what's happening within you. In other words, you could be poor and dress like a wealthy person. You could be rich and dress like a poor person, and you are fooling the people around you, right? Everybody knows that there's studies, people that go to Grand Central Station, and they say we are and they basically say, I left my wallet. Could you give me a few dollars to get out to the train? And if the people are dressed nicely, they can make thousands of dollars. If they're dressed poorly, they'll make nothing. So in other words, people judge people by their garments, and that, of course, is external and negative and betrayal because your garments don't have to tell the truth of who you really are. So that's one point of the negative side of garments. The Kabbalah explains that the soul also has garments. And the garments of the soul, as opposed to the personality of the soul, which is who I am and how I'm feeling right now, and what's my perspective right now, the garments of the soul would be how I express myself to the outside world, just like the garments allow me to express myself and to walk around the outside world. So what I speak, what I do, and even what I think, what I choose to think about consciously are the garments. And they're garments because they're not who I am. I don't have to, I could feel very unkind or very upset and very cruel, and yet I could do an act of kindness. I could actually say something nice, even if I'm not feeling that what I'm saying. Why? Because I could betray. I feel I'm not happy with you right now, but you ask me how you're doing. I say, oh, I'm so happy to see you. It's not true. It's betrayal. But that's the garment. The garment is you could put on a garment and betray. Now, you could say, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, would you want to live in a world where there's complete honesty, where there's no betrayal at all, where there's no ability to hide my thoughts, where I always say the truth? I'll tell you one thing, nobody would ever talk to me again because inevitably, I'm not so happy with the people around me. So at some point, I'm going to have to say what I really think. No, it's better, not better. The reality is living in civilization requires the person to put on a garment, betray. I don't feel kind. I don't feel happy. I'm not happy to see you, but I smile and say, I'm so happy to see you. That's a betrayal. So that's why garments have the word, come from the word beged, betrayal, because they are. Its origin is betrayal, and what they do is, and they help us betray in the sense, not in the sense that I'm projecting a lie outside of me. I'm not consistent. My outside is not consistent with my inside. That is what garments are. Okay. On the other hand, if you want to look at the positive is the same word, the same garment, beged, could also be a simla. And simla is the same words as shalem, as complete. Garments could make me complete. And that's exactly the other side of the token of being not honest is, if I am not kind, argues Judaism, if I engage in acts of kindness or in words of kindness or in kind thoughts, that will make me more complete. I will become more kind. And you see that in the garments as well. Why do people go spend? Why is the garment industry a billion-dollar industry, multiple billion-dollar industries? Because people sense that if I put something on that's nice, it's not just vanity. It's not just I'm trying to impress the other person. It's also going to affect how I feel about myself. And that's the reality. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. That's the reality. The garments affect the outside, affects the inside. The garments affect the person's own estimation of self. And this is not a bad thing. The Talmud mentions the Talmudic sage, Rabbi Yochanan, that he would refer to his garments as mechabduta, that which gives me honor. You put on a nice suit, you feel good. You put on a nice dress, you feel good. That's the reality. But that's the physical reality that is a mirror of the spiritual truth. And the spiritual truth is that the garments of the soul, the thought, speech, and action will make you more beautiful on the inside. So I'm not feeling kind and I act kind, or I speak words of kindness, or I think thoughts of kindness, that would actually make me more kind. Now, it's an interesting thing that one of the reasons why they're called garments also, thought, speech, and action, is because they're relatively easy to change. It's not so easy to change how I feel, but it's relatively easy to change what I'm going to do, what I'm going to speak, and even what I choose to think about. That's relatively easy to change. I'm saying relatively, but it's really easy to change. Your person has in complete control of what to think, speak, and do. You're not in control of how you feel at this moment. But over time, the putting on the garments is also going to affect how you feel. So going back to the discussion of the high priest, and we could talk about the details of the garments of the high priest, but I think we're going to have to end a few minutes early today. I apologize for that. But the theme is like this. The big idea is like this. If you want to become a high priest, then you have to become a high priest, because the high priest, again, is not something you outsource to the temple, because the temple is also in your soul. So just like you have an ark where you study Torah, and you have a table which represents your physical needs as they are enlightened by the service of God, and you have your menorah, which is the light that you bring into your life. You also have the person, the high priest, that performs the service. And you look at yourself and say, I'm not motivated. I'm not inspired. I'm not feeling spiritual right now. How do I come close before God? How do I come to perform the service? And what the Torah says is, Torah doesn't say, oh, Aaron, let's see how Aaron is feeling today. Let's send him to the shrink to make sure he's in a good mood and he's in a spiritual space. No, that's not what the Torah says. Torah says, put on beautiful garments. If you put on beautiful garments, you will be able to serve in the temple. And what that means is thought, speech, and action. And therefore, I may not be feeling up to what I'm supposed to be doing today. That could be whatever I'm supposed to be doing. That could be interacting with people, selling a product, raising children, whatever it is. I don't have patience for my children, whatever it is. How could I be a priest? How could I bring holiness into this world? I'm not feeling up to it. The answer is the garments. You can have beautiful garments even if you're not feeling beautiful inside. And the reality is that if you do acts of kindness, and you speak words of kindness, and you think thoughts of kindness, it's going to affect how you are. It's going to affect your inside as well. And then you'll be a proper priest and high priest and be able to bring the light into your temple and have the light of the menorah illuminate your reality. Okay, a lot more to say. We got carried away a little bit with introductions, but I hope this was interesting and enjoyable to some degree. Hopefully we could meet next week in good health and have a wonderful day. If anyone has a comment or question, I have 60 seconds. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. So nice to see everybody. We should see each other in good health.